Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. I have done my best today to find the beigest wall in my house, so apologies if you're used to the yellow of the office now and, you know, the life of the greenery that I have in there. But today we must pay homage to the beige. So if you haven't yet heard of the phenomenon of the sad beige mum, or just sad beige in general, the term was kind of coined by an Instagram creator called That Sad Beige Lady. She happens to be a librarian, so shout out, and also a writer, and she does a lot of critical analysis of social media. And the trend that has her the most concerned and perplexed is this sort of influencer aesthetic, which is completely based around neutrals and in particular pale colors. Sometimes people dabble in some pastels just to be a little bit daring, but mostly it's whites and creams and beiges. And in particular, the influencers who seem to favor this trend and who seem to be making a lot of content around it are young mums, and particularly mums with babies and toddlers. These influencer mums are so obsessed with their online image that they're basically curating their children's lives down to the T and making sure that everything they have, whatever toys they have, their rooms, the whole aesthetic of the child's environment, what they wear, is just 100% beige. It's gotten to the point where a lot of these mums actually have online tutorials about how to spray paint their children's toys into beige. Which kind of defeats the purpose of the whole aesthetic, because the whole aesthetic is centered around being environmentally friendly, which these spray paints are not, and a lot of the toys that they're spray painting are plastics, and also being non-toxic, which again, spray painting plastic toys is not non-toxic. In fact, it's the complete opposite of non-toxic. It's basically ensuring that your child is going to ingest some hardcore paint when they start licking those toys, which they will. These days you can decorate your kids' room in a minimalist palette of neutrals, throw birthday parties with pristine white bouncy castles, and dress your children in personality neutral shades of cream, ivory, mushroom, champagne, and almond. So is this developmentally good for children to be so deprived of color in their immediate environment? Well, as a psychology student, I would say no. Children need to be exposed to a variety of stimulating environmental factors. Some of these parents on social media are concerned about overstimulation, which is a valid concern depending on the child. So in some respects, it is good to have a generally neutral environment, but with things that you can take out and put back and kind of stimulate when they need to be stimulated, and then remove it when they become overwhelmed. And I think that it's okay to err on the side of pastel colors when it comes to decorating a child's room. You certainly don't need it to be gaudy and over the top on the walls, because you can't get away from that. It's kind of the house at that point. So it's fine when the aesthetic is like muted tones, and more subtle hues. But children still need some liveliness in their life. They need things to look at, especially when they're babies, because babies can't really interact with things very much. They are somewhat reliant on their parents for getting them from A to B, including from one side of the room to the other. But developmentally, children need exposure to a variety of things, and they need to interact with a wide environment so that they can learn what it means and so that they can grow and connect synapses in their brain. So why would parents deprive their children of important environmental stimulation for their development? That seems kind of counterintuitive to this very overly involved parent. And the answer kind of comes back to a couple of things. So first of all, control. Let's face it, they've just given birth to an agent of chaos, and their lives are going to be forever changed, and there's very little that they can do about it. But while that agent of chaos is a small, helpless child, there is a fair amount of control that a parent can exert. When children are babies, you can dress them however you want instead of having to deal with screaming tantrums about how they want to dress. You can curate all of their toys and make sure that they're only playing with things that you want them to play with. But control is not really what love is about. Love is about allowing the other person to blossom, allowing them to discover who they are and to grow into that. Another factor into why this has become a popular phenomenon on social media is the sort of quiet luxury, rich aesthetic. People are still aspirational, even when they don't necessarily have the means to be a Kardashian. And if you've ever seen Kim Kardashian's home, it is basically a beige and white museum. It doesn't even look like people actually live there. So the aesthetic is aspirational in terms of signaling to other people wealth and status. The aesthetic is also usually associated with being eco-friendly and being environmentally conscious, which are great things, but you don't have to be beige to do that. Many years ago, when I was researching, toxicity in the home and things like that, I had severe allergies and migraines. So I was looking into household chemicals and all that sort of stuff. And Jessica Alba had come out with her book, which was all about eco-friendly living. And one of the things that she noted in her book is that people would come over to her house and they would judge her as being not environmentally friendly, and they would talk about how great they were for having this all white, all beige house, and how environmentally friendly they were, and how she was not doing that. And she actually pointed out all of her furniture that she got either recycled or restored. It was all natural products, it was eco-friendly products, it was low toxicity products. But she used color in her house, and they were judging her based on color in her house. And the other thing about her house is that it is ethnically inspired. So being part Latin American, she had influences from Mexico. So not only were people presuming that she was not environmentally friendly because of the aesthetic of her house, but they were also kind of looking down on her because they viewed the ethnic influences of her decor as being... When it comes to the white and beige aesthetic, you won't find much ethnicity mixed into that, so you lose a lot of the flavor of life. I've always found the Moroccan style very inspirational. I quite like the Spanish and the Latin American style pleasing. I mean, I am part Spanish. Personally, I've never viewed these particular styles as being cheaper in any way. They're, if anything, kind of high market in Australia. But in the USA, it's a different matter. So, if you think about it, there are economic reasons for people to jump onto this bandwagon. There are kind of moral grandstanding inspiration for people to jump onto this bandwagon. They want to be able to look down on other people for not being environmentally friendly. And they want to signal to other people that they are virtuous in some way. And there is also the urge to control other people and to control the environment around them. So all of these factors combined kind of make me think that this is a very narcissistic trend. So let's have a look at the psychology behind all of this virtue signaling on social media. This peer-reviewed article called The Dark Side of Going Green talks about how there is a certain personality associated with moral grandstanding and status signaling on social media. So it says the current study sought to test whether the dark triad personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy can be indirectly linked to organic food consumption through consumers' levels of virtue signaling, status consumption, and praise from others. Based on a survey of 337 people and structural equation modeling, we found consistent evidence for the notion that the links between each dark triad trait and A, organic food purchase intentions, and B, willingness to pay for organic foods are mediated by status consumption and praise from others. Additionally, virtue signaling mediated this interplay for people who exhibit high versus low degrees of narcissism and Machiavellianism, but not those who exhibit high versus low degrees of psychopathy. Given that sustainability-related responses are typically portrayed as pro-social and positive, these results paint a more complex picture, with our findings linking organic consumption to a set of dark personality traits. In other words, psychopaths don't really care about what other people think of them in terms of their pro-social, moral grandstanding, but narcissists definitely do, and people who are high on Machiavellianism, which is a type of personality that exploits other people and weaponizes social interactions. Narcissists will engage in all sorts of pro-social behavior because it gives them the fuel that they need, the narcissistic fuel, such as praise from other people and social status, as well as painting them in a very virtuous light, because they often need to maintain a facade with other people and appear to be better than what they actually are, because what they actually are is awful. This peer-reviewed journal article says moral grandstanding as a narcissistic intrinsic satisfaction. So it says the aim of the study is to define the concept of moral grandstanding and discuss it in antecedents, motivations behind it, and implications. Moral grandstanding is described as contributing to moral discourse to persuade others that one is morally respectable. Individuals who value their moral standing are more concerned about their own self than the topics they discuss. Therefore, it is likely that individuals who perform moral grandstanding may be high on the narcissistic personality trait. Although moral grandstanding can bring about reputation and fame to individuals, it can be associated with society contribution in some cases. While advertising their pro-social behavior, individuals' true motivation may not be obvious. Thus, it is essential to understand their actual motivation for the behavior in question, as well as their level of narcissism, in order to understand whether the behavior is considered as an example of moral grandstanding. So in other words, not all moral conversations are for the purposes of moral grandstanding. It really depends on the motivations of the individual person as to why they're having these conversations. Anyway, it continues, pathological narcissism and the intrinsic-extrinsic motivation concept of self-determination theory were used to extend the current understanding of the moral grandstanding concept in the present study. What do the writers mean by intrinsic and extrinsic? Well, in psychology, intrinsic is an internal motivation. So you're internally motivated to do something by like a moral compass. whereas extrinsic motivation is you're motivated to do something by external factors. So, for example, people praising you. As you can imagine, narcissists are not usually motivated by an internal moral compass that, makes them feel good about their choices without other people validating it. They actually need all of the external validation in order to feel like what they're doing is worthwhile. Otherwise, they're not going to be bothered. So they're not motivated to do something because it's the right thing to do. They're motivated to do something because they will be recognized for it. This article is called Objects of Virtue, Moral Grandstanding and the Capitalization of Ethics Under Neoliberal Commodity Fetishism, which is a very long title. So the abstract says, this article critiques conspicuous displays of morality within public discourse, recently framed as moral grandstanding, from the perspective of an intersubjective critical realist theory of ethics. Drawing on honest recognition theory as the basis of a qualified explanatory critique, I argue that these practices are not mere aberrations within moral discourse, but a necessary consequence of the neoliberal imperative to turn all aspects of the self into market assets. Neoliberal commodity fetishism also and especially involves the commodification of moral character as a means of economic competition, as exemplified in recent discussions of ethical capital. This objectification categorically precludes intersubjectivity as the basis of ethical life and produces a cognitive structure resembling narcissistic pathology, characterized by the pervasive objectification of self and other. Critical realists should therefore reject moral grandstanding, not only for its detrimental effects on public discourse, but because in subordinating morality to the market, it is fundamentally anti-ethical. What they're talking about is the objectification of the self and your own home and your own children on social media in order to, expand your worth as a person and to commodify your life in many respects. Moral philosophy researchers have essentially said that what people do on social media like this is unethical. It's narcissistic. This research article, called Moral Grandstanding in Public Discourse, Status-Seeking Motives as a Potential Explanatory Mechanism in Predicting Conflict, says public discourse is often caustic and conflict-filled. No truer words were said. This trend seems to be particularly evident when the content of such discourse is around moral issues, broadly defined, and when the discourse occurs on social media. Several explanatory mechanisms for such conflict have been explored in recent psychological and social science literatures. The present work sought to examine a potentially novel explanatory mechanism defined in philosophical literature, moral grandstanding. According to philosophical accounts, moral grandstanding is the use of moral talk to seek social status. For the present work, we conducted 6 studies. Across studies, we found initial support for the validity of moral grandstanding as a construct. Specifically, moral grandstanding motivation was associated with status-seeking personality traits, as well as greater political and moral conflict in daily life. In other words, people who engage in moral grandstanding, especially on social media, are found to have status-seeking personality traits, which would be narcissistic personality traits, and they often have a lot of conflict in their life. This is something that is a marker of their relationships, that they are conflict-prone. Social media has made lifestyle both a commodity and a moral issue. People sell their morality and lifestyle to an audience for status and recognition. The minimalist movement, the zero-waste movement, the eco-friendly lifestyle should be intrinsically motivated because the individual cares about their impact on the environment and their family. However, all of these movements are inevitably commandeered and overrun by narcissists, trying to use them for status and virtue signaling, which are extrinsic rewards.
So instead of the ethos of living in a low toxic home for the health of the family, it turns into an aesthetic, which is all appearance and no substance. It doesn't matter if you spray paint your kids' toys with toxic paint, as long as you have the appearance of a home which is eco-friendly and neutral. It's an empty and shallow semblance of the real thing, purely to garner adulation on social media.
When I first came across the sad beige mum phenomenon, my very first thought when I saw it was that it was basically embodied by Meghan Markle. Now, before people get offended, this is not necessarily to hate on Meghan Markle. I actually have some sympathy for her. I can relate to what she's going through in some respects because I have seen it in my own family. The internalized racism, the urge for status amongst other people whose opinion don't really matter, the need to constantly virtue signal to other people and to appear morally superior, and the need to control other people and the environment around them. These are urges that narcissistic people always have, and my grandmother had it in spades. Just like Meghan, my grandmother was mixed race, and she did not find much of a place for herself in any particular community. In Fiji, where she was born, people who were a mixture of both Fijian and Indian were ostracized by both communities because they hated each other. And if you add in there white, then you don't really fit in anywhere. And this is actually something that psychology has studied.
Let's start with how narcissism is actually created. The etiology of narcissistic personality disorder is multifaceted. Some studies have suggested a genetic predisposition toward the disorder. Traits such as aggression, reduced tolerance to distress, and dysfunctional affect regulation is prominent in persons with NPD. If you're wondering what dysfunctional affect regulation is, basically it means people who are emotionally volatile. They're people who cannot regulate their own emotions or won't regulate their own emotions very well. So they tend to flip out on people and explode. But they can also be very sulky and sullen and kind of withdraw from social interactions because they're not getting their own way. Anyway, that's what that means. Developmental experiences, negative in nature, being rejected as a child, and a fragile ego during early childhood may have contributed to the occurrence of NPD in adulthood. In contrast, excessive praise, including the belief that a child may have extraordinary abilities, may also lead to NPD. So studies have found that both rejection for children and also being excessively praised are a combination that tends to result in narcissistic personality. What sort of rejection are we talking about? Well, this article, which is titled "You Think You're Black? Exploring Black Mixed Race Experiences of Black Rejection," says, utilizing interview data with 37 British people of mixed white and Black Caribbean heritage, this paper draws upon the concept of horizontal hostility to describe how Black mixed race experiences of Black rejection impact on self-perceptions and expressed ethnic identities. In demonstrating the effects of being excluded from a relatable collective Black identity, the paper argues that horizontal hostility is critical in the project of theorizing mixed race. Experiences of horizontal hostility represent significant turning points in mixed race lives, as they can prompt reconsiderations of mixed race positionings within the broader Black imagined space. Beyond the benefits that horizontal hostility offers to mixed race studies, it provides insights into conceptualizations of Blackness as a collective racial identity, community, and politics. This article unpacks how, when, and why its boundaries are policed, adding to debates relating to the future formation and maintenance of ethnic group identities and categories more generally. So essentially what they found is that simply having a certain genetic makeup does not automatically give you acceptance into the community. In fact, the community is often policed by people who determine whether you are allowed in or not. And we're familiar with this when it comes to being white, because that's well documented, but it's less well known that this happens in minority groups as well, but it does. And the result of that policing of an ethnic identity results in something called cultural homelessness. So this article, titled Cultural Homelessness, Multi-Minority Status, Ethnic Identity Development and Self-Esteem, says, the study presents a measure of cultural homelessness, a construct developed to explain the experiences of some individuals having early life immersion in more than one culture. Culturally homeless individuals report pervasive experiences of being different, mixed racial, ethnic, and/or cultural heritages within their families of origin and/or between their families and the surrounding socio-cultural context, resulting in structural marginality, repeated subjection to contradictory cultural demands, and the acquisition of conflicting frames of reference for their behavior. Ambiguous physical presentation and the complexity of code switching across multiple cultural frames of reference at a young age may lead to confused or inappropriate social behavior, resulting in rejection and discrimination by both minority and majority groups. Chronic feelings of not belonging, self-blame and shame, social and emotional isolation, cultural identity confusion, and the desire to find a cultural home. Empirical findings operationalizing this construct show associations of cultural homelessness criteria with gender, risk factors related to multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural status, ethnic identity, and self-esteem. The term code switching is basically referring to when people switch from one social group to another, and they have to learn all of the socially acceptable norms of that group in order to fit in. And everybody does it. So everyone has different social groups. I go to work and I behave a certain way with my colleagues. I go to church and I behave a certain way with my church friends. And the social groups are distinct and separate. They have different codes of behavior that I must adhere to. So for children growing up in a mixed race home, they can learn some of the social coding that they have to use with different groups, but it doesn't mean that they learn it perfectly every time, and they can get things confused. They can behave in the way that is socially acceptable to the other group and end up offending the group that they're with, and they might not appear to be, identical with one group, and so they're treated with mistrust and suspicion by that group and not readily accepted. They can end up confused about their identity and also feeling isolated, lonely, and have low self-esteem. Sometimes the result of that are things like eating disorders. So this article, titled Eating Disorder Prevalence Among Multiracial US Undergraduate and Graduate Students, is multiracial risk different than the sum of each identity? And it says, the number of individuals identifying as multiracial in the US has significantly increased in the past few decades, yet they are rarely the focus of study in eating disorders, or ED research. The current study is among the first to examine the prevalent estimates of ED pathology across several distinct multiracial groups. To contrast prevalence estimates of ED pathology in each multiracial group with those among the corresponding monoracial identities, and to investigate these findings intersectionally with gender identity. Multiracial individuals identifying as American Indian or Hispanic exhibited the highest prevalence estimates of elevated ED pathology, 41.4% compared to 23.5% in the full sample. These results have important implications for understanding ED pathology in multiracial individuals and should inform intervention and treatment efforts to support individuals from these underserved groups. In other words, there's a correlation between being mixed race and suffering from eating disorders. One of the things that contributes to cultural homelessness is witnessing racism from your friends. So this article, titled Let the Racism Tell You Who Your Friends Are, The Effects of Racism on Social Connections and Life Satisfaction for Multiracial People, says, multiracial people in the United States do not fit into traditional racial groups and are thus thought to be at an increased risk of social isolation. The current study examines the contributions of racial and multiracial specific discrimination in predicting multiracial people's social connections to people of various racial groups. Also examined is whether relationships between these types of discrimination and life satisfaction are explained by friendship and community satisfaction. Results indicated that racial and multiracial specific discrimination each related to decreased feelings of commonality and acceptance among white people. As multiracial people experienced more racial discrimination, they generally reported having more in common with, but less acceptance from, racial groups of color. As multiracial people reported more racial or multiracial specific discrimination, they reported lower proportions of white friends and higher proportions of multiracial friends. Relationships between racial discrimination and life satisfaction were partially explained by community satisfaction, whereas relationships between multiracial discrimination and life satisfaction were fully explained by decreased community satisfaction. In other words, people who are multiracial identify more with minority groups because they have similar experiences of not being accepted, but the minority groups reject them just as much, if not more, than the majority group does. They are essentially in social purgatory. For people who can pass as white, it's usually easier to try and blend in with the majority culture, perhaps by becoming a sad beige mum. However, this study found that mixed-race people have better friendships with each other because they are less likely to be exposed to racist conversations. I have experienced this personally when, people that I have known for years, who I've been friends with, suddenly come out with incredibly awful racist comments about literally people that I am related to. And it has ended the friendship, and I have found myself alone. So it's a horrible feeling. But at the same time, it tells you who your real friends are and who you don't really want to be hanging out with, because whether you are mixed race or not, who wants to hang out with racists?
In many respects, Meghan has used her sort of passing status, which is what my grandmother had as well. She looked white, so she could pass in communities in like the 1930s when racism was really, really systemic. Like it's kind of not so much anymore. We're very much almost giving preferential treatment to ethnic minorities. And, you can debate the value of that in society. But back in the 1930s, she went to a boarding school. She was the oldest child in her family, so she was the first person that went to this boarding school. And they accepted her because she looked white. But when her younger brother came to the same school, they kicked both of them out because they suddenly realized that this was a mixed race family. And the thing is, my grandmother was extremely rich as a child. She was so privileged. I mean, they had money to send children to boarding school. So when she was younger, they had servants. Basically, as my grandmother was growing up, she never had to wash a dish or make her bed in her life. In fact, she didn't even know how to until after she got married. And her mother was so concerned about her having to fend for herself that her wedding gift to the couple was a servant for the first year of marriage. Who gives another person a human being for their wedding gift? It was not slavery. But it's still weird. So my grandmother was extremely economically privileged, very similar to Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle grew up with her dad, who was a Hollywood lighting producer lighting director. So he was well paid and also well respected in the industry. He worked on the set of Married with Children and won awards. Not only that, but he also won the lottery at one point during her childhood. So he had the means to send Meghan to a Catholic school, like a prestigious school. He also had the means to send her to university and to pay for all of her tuition, which she later on told people that she paid herself, but her father has contradicted that statement and produced some receipts. So what happens to a child when they are brought up with extreme privilege on one hand and also extreme rejection on the other hand? Well, I know what it did to my grandmother, and I know what psychology says about this phenomenon.
Now, just to be clear, I obviously cannot diagnose someone that I've never met, and I've never met Meghan Markle. So this is purely speculation on my part, and it's just talking about patterns of behavior and things that I've noticed and correlations that are available in psychology literature, which we can talk about. This article from the Mayo Clinic entitled Narcissistic Personality Disorder says narcissistic personality disorder is a mental health condition in which people have an unreasonably high sense of their own importance. They need and seek too much attention and want people to admire them. People with this disorder may lack the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others, but behind the mask of extreme confidence, they are not sure of their self-worth and are easily upset by the slightest criticism. And in fact, with narcissistic personality, they don't even have to be criticized to feel offended and to fly off the handle. It just has to be their perception of criticism. And usually they interpret neutral interactions with hostility. So that's something that's found in the literature. It's not known what causes narcissistic personality disorder. The cause is likely complex. Narcissistic personality disorder may be linked to environmental factors such as parent-child relationships with either too much adoration or too much criticism that don't match the child's actual experiences and achievements. Genetic factors, which are inherited characteristics such as certain personality traits. Or neurobiology, the connection between the brain and behavior and thinking.
Narcissism is literally created by this very strange toxic mix where children are, on one hand rejected and on the other hand puffed up in lots of different ways, whether it's an indulgent parent like Thomas Markle, who constantly buoyed up his daughter's ego and never said no to her and always praised her, even when she was a total brat.
Okay, we've been out here for 3 days so far.
And I have not caught a fish.
So we're going to try for another half hour.
And then we're going horseback riding.
Okay. Again. Determined.
Or if it's people like my grandmother, who was wealthy, privileged, intelligent, beautiful, and yet at the same time not accepted widely by people around her. So how was Meghan Markle rejected? What was the story there? We're not exactly sure whether she experienced racism as a child. Certainly in the documentary on Netflix called Harry and Meghan, she came out with this very interesting statement, which was, "I've never been treated like a black woman before." And I found that very telling. It kind of, I don't know, it was just weird and icky and kind of made me stop and think. So she's never been treated like a black woman before. How does she think black women should be treated? Does it mean that she doesn't identify as a black woman? Does she not have some kind of kinship with that? Does she hold herself in a higher position than black women? Obviously she passes for white, So a lot of black people have criticized her for, claiming oppression in some way, even though she's never really experienced it. But in many respects, she has experienced racism. She's experienced racism because she's white. It's not because she's black that people criticize her. Most people who criticize her because of her narcissistic behavior. But when she is criticized for her race, it's not for being black. So I do have a lot of sympathy for Meghan Markle because I do think she experiences racism. But why has she so obviously rejected her own ethnicity in so many respects? You look at before and after photos of her, she's changed her teeth, she's changed her hair, she's changed her nose, and almost all of the things that would identify her as being part black are the things that she has erased through cosmetic procedures. And I think personally, so this is my own theory, I don't have any evidence, well, I do have evidence to back it up, but I don't have proof. Definitive proof. This is just my own personal opinion and speculation. But I believe that the biggest rejection that Meghan Markle experienced during her childhood was from her mother. Her mother was always kind of flaky. She was a pot-smoking hippie who just basically bounced when Meghan was still a kid. And she went off to do her own thing, wasn't really present as a parent, and left most of the raising to Thomas Markle. When you have one parent who is rejecting you as a child and another parent who is constantly puffing you up, that is a recipe for narcissism. And so what is a child to do? Do you embrace the side of yourself that reminds you of the parent that rejects you? Or do you reject it back in an attempt to regain some kind of control over the situation? It's that thing that you see all the time where people are like, they ask someone out and the person says no, and then they're like, well, you were ugly anyway. That's exactly how narcissism is. It's this immediate knee-jerk reaction to rejection that just lashes out at the drop of a hat. And it's protective of the person. It's a way to protect them from harm psychologically. But ultimately, it turns them into an incredibly toxic person to be around. I found my grandmother to be very challenging to be around, and my own mother was also kind of impossible to be around because of the narcissism. So I understand from an insider's perspective what it's like to live with a narcissist and how pitiful they are in so many respects, and why it's really hard to really be too mad at them. There's always this urge to try and help them, to try and, make them feel secure in some way, but you can't. They will never feel secure. It's something that they have to work through internally, and they have to face it in their own mind. In later life, my grandmother was still constantly trying to prove to people that she was worthy, that she, deserved respect in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things that I always remember about my grandmother was these stories that she told about going into shops and being treated rudely by a sales assistant, or, perhaps it was the owner, who knows. But she would go into these shops and be browsing, and the sales assistant would basically look down on her, treat her very condescendingly, be rude, snide, whatever, or at least that's how she interpreted it. I mean, no one else was really there, so it's hard to say. I don't know for sure if that's what happened, but I have certainly experienced enough rude sales staff to believe that it's possible. So she would be treated with contempt and rudeness, and in an attempt to prove herself worthy of these horrible people, she would spend hundreds of dollars in the store. Like, her thinking was, oh, if they're going to look down on me, I'm going to prove that I'm better than them by giving them all of my money. Like, and she would end up with stuff that she never wanted, never intended to buy, didn't need, and couldn't afford. And to me, it's just such a strange thing to do. I don't really understand that mentality. Like, if someone's rude to me, I'm not going to give them my money. I'm going to take my money elsewhere, where someone deserves it. But that's the mentality of a narcissist. They're always trying to prove themselves. And so you can see it in Meghan Markle. She's got this absurd mansion in Montecito that they don't really need and they can't really afford. And she's constantly spending thousands of dollars on her wardrobe. I mean, when she was with the royal family, she almost broke the bank for them with her wardrobe. Prince Charles personally footed the bill for it because they're not allowed to use tax money for that. And in one of the interviews, like after leaving the royal family, when Meghan was busy bashing them for perceived slights, and with narcissists you can't ever really be sure whether anything actually happened because their perception is always twisted. But one of the things that she said in one of the interviews where she was bashing the royal family was that they forced her to wear neutrals all the time, and that just doesn't ring true. First of all, she hasn't ceased wearing neutrals. Her entire wardrobe is white, black, and beige. Like, she is the queen of sad beige mums. Her house is 100% neutral. All of her backdrops for any videos and recordings that she does are like white couches. Who lives with white couches? People who don't have children or pets. But she accused the royal family of forcing her to wear boring clothes, as though it was some kind of agenda to eclipse her bright, shining star. And yet she is the one who persists in choosing these outfits. I don't think anyone forced her to wear neutrals. In fact, the royal family is renowned for wearing colours. Queen Elizabeth was famous for wearing block bright colours everywhere she went on public engagements, because it was her way of ensuring that people in the crowd could actually spot her. It was part of her public service to wear colour, and she advocated for it. Princess Catherine wears lots of colour. The royal family's policy is to wear colour. Like, they very rarely wear neutrals. They don't wear black unless it's for funerals, which is why Meghan was criticized for wearing a lot of black. And it's like, she's trying to push this narrative that the royal family controlled her image. But if the royal family controlled her image at all, then she wouldn't have been able to wear black at all. So clearly she's a liar. And that's the problem with narcissists. You can't tell whether anything is the truth or not because they lie constantly. It's this whole virtue signaling thing, moral grandstanding, trying to always play the victim, trying to always be the most morally superior person in the room, and trying to condemn other people for not being controllable. And it's like, yeah, other people are not controllable, including your children. The sad beige mums really need to learn how to let go of that death grip that they have on their children's lives. Because if they don't, their children are going to grow up resenting them. It will be very interesting to see how this plays out in the decades to come, whether there are psychological effects from children growing up in the Instagram era and being forced to look a certain way by their parents. Not necessarily because the kids are on camera, but because all of their lives and their houses are on camera. And I do wonder how Meghan and Harry's children are being raised, whether they're going to have some serious issues as they get older. But if my own life is anything to go by, as the kids grow up and become adults and become independent, if they don't turn into narcissists themselves, then they will eventually break free, get the healing that they need, and hopefully reconnect with the family that's not insane. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you next time with another... Well, we're probably going to get back into subscription next time, so stay tuned. Take care, God bless. See you next time. Bye.